The soft chime of the doorbell was barely noticeable over the sound of bustling customers, the shuffle of feet, and the faint hum of music playing in the background. The store was alive with activity, employees darting between shelves, restocking items, and assisting customers. It was just another day in a chain of retail stores that had once been a dream turned into a thriving business. But today, something was different. A man walked through the door, tall, with a clean-cut appearance that suggested he had come from a high-stakes meeting or a quiet conference room. He wore a simple hoodie, his jeans unremarkable, blending into the crowd, yet his presence felt commanding, almost magnetic. His eyes scanned the room, calculating, assessing. Despite the casual attire, anyone who knew him would recognize the quiet authority in his posture, the confidence in his every movement. To the employees in the store, however, he was just another customer. They had no way of knowing that this man, walking so nonchalantly among them, was the very person who owned the building they worked in, the CEO of the company, the one who had spent years building an empire from scratch. The man's name was Jonathan Pierce. Most people, even the employees in his stores, had no idea what he looked like. He preferred it that way. Jonathan was a man of power, a man who thrived in the shadows, pulling the strings from behind the curtain. He rarely made public appearances. His face, his identity, was something that he kept hidden for the most part. Today, however, he had decided to pay an unexpected visit to one of his stores. He walked with a sense of purpose but kept his head slightly lowered, not wanting to draw attention. The employees were busy, and most of the customers were too focused on their shopping to notice him. The atmosphere was calm, even mundane, a typical day in a typical store. No one knew who he was, and that was just the way Jonathan liked it. As he wandered deeper into the store, he took in the familiar sight of shelves lined with products, the neatly arranged displays, and the general hustle of the place. This was his world, the world he had created. He had built the brand from the ground up, spent years navigating the rough waters of business to get to this point. This store, like all of his others, was a symbol of his success. His eyes wandered across the aisles until they landed on the cashier counter. There, a young woman was sorting through some paperwork, glancing up now and then to help customers. Her name was Sarah, a new employee who had joined the team just a few months ago. She had the look of someone still trying to get comfortable in her role, bright-eyed, eager, and determined to prove herself. Jonathan couldn't help but study her as he approached the counter. He had seen her around, but he had never interacted with her directly. She was just one of the many faces in the sea of employees who came and went through the store, but today, something about her stood out. Perhaps it was her quiet confidence, or maybe it was the way she handled herself, independent, yet professional. When she looked up and saw him standing there, she didn't seem to recognize him at first. Most people wouldn't, considering how rare it was for him to make an appearance in one of his stores. "Can I help you with something?" Sarah asked, her voice calm and professional, yet there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes. She had probably seen a lot of customers come through the door, but something about the way he stood there, so composed, made her pause. Jonathan smiled, his gaze softening just slightly. "I'd like to make a purchase," he said, keeping his voice even, neutral. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, yet he couldn't help but notice the faint shift in the air. It was as though something was off. Sarah met his eyes, but instead of the usual friendly smile or the quick motions of a store employee trying to close a sale, her gaze hardened. For a split second, Jonathan was taken aback. The young woman didn't immediately offer to ring up his purchase. She didn't gesture for him to place the items on the counter. Instead, she stood there, her posture rigid, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "You're not welcome here," Sarah said, her words cutting through the air like a knife. The moment hung in the balance, suspended in shock. Jonathan's mind stalled. He blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. Was this a joke? Was she messing with him? He looked at her face again, trying to discern any sign of humor, but there was nothing. Her expression was serious, even intense. Jonathan's mouth went dry. Not welcome here. This was his store, his business. He had built it, invested his time, his money, his blood, and sweat into making it a success. People came to his stores, customers and employees alike. He was the one who paid their salaries, made decisions, and controlled everything from the top. How could anyone, especially an employee, say such a thing to him? He stood frozen, momentarily unsure of what to do next. His mind raced, scrambling for an explanation. Was this some sort of mistake? Did she know who he was? Did she recognize him? Jonathan had always kept a low profile, and for good reason. His wealth, his power, his very identity were things he rarely flaunted. He didn't want to be recognized, didn't want the attention. But now, something wasn't right. Was this employee simply having a bad day, or was there more to it? He could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable, as Sarah didn't back down. Her eyes remained locked on his, unflinching. It wasn't fear or respect he saw in them. It was something else. It was defiance. Jonathan opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come right away. His usual confidence, his ability to control every situation, seemed to evaporate in the face of this unexpected rejection. He was used to power, he was used to having things his way. This, however, was something entirely new. The words she had spoken, the rejection, the coldness, pierced his carefully constructed world like a bullet. It was a reminder that, despite his wealth, his status, and his business empire, he was still human. And humans were vulnerable, fragile in the face of certain truths. For a long moment, Jonathan didn't say anything. His mind scrambled to find the right response. Should he reveal who he was? Should he pull out his ID, show her his position, remind her that she was an employee, and he was the one who signed her paycheck? But something inside him held back. He didn't want to be that person. The person who wielded power simply because they had it. Instead, he stood silently for a few more seconds, watching Sarah's face for any sign of change. But none came. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft but edged with a quiet authority. I think there's been some sort of misunderstanding. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. Instead, she crossed her arms, giving him a look that said everything he needed to know. No misunderstanding, she replied coolly. I don't want you here. The air between them thickened with unspoken tension. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest as the truth of the situation began to settle in. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a prank. It was real. She meant every word. His mind raced, but the only thing that came to him was an unsettling realization. This was not just about a rejected purchase. It was something deeper. Something much more personal. And as Jonathan stood there, unsure of how to proceed, he couldn't shake the feeling that his world, his carefully curated, perfectly organized world, had just started to crumble. The quiet hum of the store seemed louder in the wake of Sarah's words. Jonathan Pierce felt the weight of them, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on his chest. I don't want you here. The phrase lingered in his mind, echoing through the silence between them. He could hardly believe it. He had built this empire, worked tirelessly to make it a success, yet in this one small corner of it, an employee, a stranger, had rejected him without a second thought. The world he had worked so hard to create, the world where every decision was his to make, where every voice was quieted in the face of his power, seemed suddenly fragile. He looked at Sarah again. There was no trace of fear or respect in her expression, only a quiet resolve. She stood her ground, arms crossed over her chest, and her gaze unwavering. This wasn't the reaction he had expected. He had imagined an apology, maybe confusion, but not this. Jonathan had always been in control. He thrived in chaos, in situations where others might falter. But here, in this small, unremarkable store, he was at a loss. It was a stark reminder of how even the most carefully constructed empire could falter, how a single moment could throw everything into question. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. He needed to understand this. He needed to find out why Sarah had rejected him. What had happened to make her act this way? Was it personal? Was it a one-off incident, or was there something more to it? For a brief moment, Jonathan considered revealing his identity. He could show her who he was, tell her that he was the owner of the company, the person who made the decisions, the person who could make or break her career. But something inside him resisted. He didn't want to win this on his terms. He didn't want to wield his power over her. He wanted the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. "Why?" he asked, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. "Why don't you want me here?" Sarah didn't immediately respond. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. Jonathan felt a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle change that made the air in the room feel thick, charged with unspoken tension. After a long pause, she spoke. "It's not about you. It's about what you represent." Jonathan's brow furrowed. What he represented? He wasn't sure if he understood. "I'm the CEO of this company," he said slowly, as though trying to give her the answer she might be expecting. "I built it from the ground up." Sarah shook her head slightly. "No. It's not just that. It's the way things are, the way things have always been." Jonathan was taken aback. He had expected her to give some sort of explanation, but this was different. She wasn't just rejecting him personally. She was rejecting the entire system he had created. He glanced around the store, taking in the rows of shelves, the cluttered counters, the faces of customers who were oblivious to the conversation taking place. This was his empire. This store was a small piece of it, but it was still a piece he had fought to build. Everything he saw was a reflection of his work, his vision, his success. But Sarah's words dug deeper than he could have imagined. They cut through the layers of his pride and self-assurance, leaving him questioning everything he thought he knew. "What do you mean by that?" Jonathan asked, his voice softer now, almost as if he were afraid to hear the answer. Sarah met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something, dare he call it pity? But then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the same calm determination. She didn't seem intimidated or afraid. In fact, there was something almost serene in her demeanor. "It's not just you," she repeated. "It's what this company has become. What it stands for. It's about the people who work here, the people who rely on this paycheck, but are constantly overlooked. It's about the promises made to them, the ideals that were sold, and the reality that followed." Jonathan felt a knot form in his stomach. He had heard complaints like this before, but they always came from the outside, critics, journalists, disgruntled former employees. He had dismissed them as noise. Noise from people who didn't understand the intricacies of business, the sacrifices that had to be made for growth, for success. But hearing it from Sarah, hearing it from someone who worked on the front lines, someone who saw the day-to-day reality of the company, felt different. "You think I don't care about the people who work here?" he asked, his voice tight. Sarah didn't flinch. "I think you care about what's convenient for you. I think you care about profit, about numbers, about making things look good. But what about the people who have to put in the work every day? What about the people who make this company what it is? Don't they deserve more?" Jonathan was silent. He had always prided himself on being a visionary, on making the tough decisions that others couldn't. He had never been one to shy away from difficult choices, from doing what was necessary for the greater good. But now, in the face of Sarah's accusations, he wasn't so sure. "I never meant for anyone to feel undervalued," Jonathan said quietly. "But I'm trying to build something that will last. I want to create a legacy. And that legacy," Sarah said, her voice low but firm, "comes at the expense of the people who make it possible." Jonathan felt a sting of guilt, but he couldn't bring himself to fully acknowledge it. He had always believed in the greater good, in the long-term vision, but hearing Sarah's words made him question whether he had lost sight of the very people who had helped him get to this point. Maybe it's not about building something grand, Sarah continued. Maybe it's about making sure the people who are part of it feel like they matter too. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Jonathan had always prided himself on his ability to see the bigger picture, but now, for the first time, he was beginning to question what that picture truly looked like. There was a long pause before he spoke again, his voice quieter now, tinged with something that sounded almost like regret. I never thought about it that way. Sarah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she simply turned her gaze back to the counter, as though the conversation was over. Jonathan watched her for a moment, trying to digest what she had said. There was so much more going on here than he had initially realized, more than he had ever taken the time to see. As he stood there, lost in thought, the sounds of the store faded into the background. His mind was whirling, spinning with new ideas, new questions, new revelations. But before he could gather his thoughts, the sound of the door chiming once again snapped him out of his trance. A customer had entered, oblivious to the tension that had unfolded just moments before. Jonathan took one last look at Sarah, who was now engaging with the customer, her demeanor calm, professional, and unbothered by their earlier exchange. He had to know more. He had to understand what Sarah and the others like her had experienced. He had to dig deeper. But that would have to wait. As he turned and walked toward the door, he could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure where this journey would take him. But one thing was clear, he couldn't continue down the same path without confronting the uncomfortable truth about his company, and himself. Jonathan Pierce's footsteps echoed through the quiet hallway of the office building. He walked briskly, his mind still reeling from the exchange he had had with Sarah in the store. The encounter had left him unsettled, more than he cared to admit. He had never been one to question his actions, his decisions, or the world he had built. Yet, something about the conversation lingered, gnawing at him like a splinter in his mind. It's about what you represent. Sarah's words echoed in his head, repeating like a mantra. What did she mean by that? What was it about the company he had created that had led to such discontent? The more he thought about it, the more questions arose, and the fewer answers he had. His mind raced as he entered his office, his sanctuary, where everything was controlled, organized, and predictable. He paused in front of his desk, staring at the papers stacked neatly in front of him, the digital screens filled with reports and figures. This was his world, a world where numbers made sense, where decisions were calculated and deliberate. Yet, in the wake of his encounter with Sarah, it felt hollow. He took a seat, running his hands through his hair. The weight of the questions pressing down on him felt heavier than anything he had faced before. He had built this company with his own two hands, but now, for the first time, he was beginning to wonder whether he had lost sight of the very people who had helped him get here. What is really going on here? His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from his assistant, Tara. Mr. Pierce, we need you in the conference room for a meeting in 15 minutes. It's urgent. Jonathan sighed and looked at the clock. He had no choice but to attend. But his mind wasn't on the meeting. It was still on Sarah, on the people who worked for him, on the larger question of whether everything he had been doing was truly worthwhile. As he walked toward the conference room, Jonathan tried to push the thoughts from his mind. He had a business to run, after all. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the truth about his company, about his role in it, was beginning to unravel. The walls that had once shielded him from reality were starting to crumble. When he entered the conference room, he found his top executives already seated around the large table. They were all present, Andrew, the CFO, Laura, the COO, and Mark, the VP of Operations. Jonathan took a seat at the head of the table, his eyes scanning the group. "What's the situation?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with an undercurrent of frustration. Andrew cleared his throat. "Mr. Pierce, we've run into a serious issue with the store operations. The sales numbers are down, and we've been getting complaints about customer service, particularly at the flagship store. He paused, glancing around the table. We need to make some changes, and fast. Jonathan's mind immediately flashed to his encounter with Sarah. The flagship store. He knew that the problems there had been festering for a while, but he had never paid them much attention. The complaints were always brushed aside as minor issues. But now, everything felt connected. The complaints, Sarah's words, the tension, it was all part of something bigger. What kind of complaints? Jonathan asked, his tone sharp. Laura spoke up. It's mostly about the staff, and it's not just one or two customers. We've had several people report poor service, unhelpful employees, and a general lack of enthusiasm. She paused, then added, we've also heard about the employees feeling undervalued, overworked, and underpaid. Jonathan frowned. The company had always prided itself on providing excellent customer service. But this was different. This wasn't just a few disgruntled customers. This was systemic. Something was happening behind the scenes, and it wasn't something he could ignore anymore. Andrew leaned forward. We've also noticed a pattern of high turnover rates at that store. Employees are leaving faster than we can hire replacements. Jonathan felt a cold knot in his stomach. This wasn't just about poor service or declining sales. This was about morale, about the very people who made the business run. It was about the employees, the ones who showed up every day to keep the operation moving. And he had been so focused on the bottom line that he had failed to see how badly they were struggling. Has anyone from HR looked into this? Jonathan asked, his voice now more intense. Mark nodded. HR has conducted some internal surveys, and the results aren't pretty. Employees feel disconnected from the company, like their voices aren't being heard. Some have even mentioned that they feel like cogs in a machine, and that the leadership doesn't care about them. Jonathan's mind flashed back to Sarah's words in the store. It's not about you. It's about what you represent. Was this what she had been talking about? Had he become the very thing she despised, the symbol of corporate greed and indifference? He ran a hand over his face, trying to process everything. How long have these issues been going on? Andrew exchanged a glance with Laura. It's been building for the past year, but it's really escalated in the last 6 months. We're on the verge of a full-blown crisis. Jonathan took a deep breath, his mind swirling with the weight of the situation. He had to act. He couldn't afford to ignore this any longer. The company was his legacy, but if he didn't address the internal problems now, he risked losing it all. All right, he said, his voice steady. We need to fix this, and we need to fix it fast. I'll visit the flagship store myself, talk to the employees, and see what's really going on. I want the truth, and I want it now. There was a moment of silence as his executives processed his words. They had expected him to delegate the task, to send someone else to handle it. But Jonathan was no longer content to remain in the dark. He needed to see the reality for himself, even if it meant confronting uncomfortable truths. We'll start with a full review of the store's operations, Laura said, but you'll need to work closely with HR to get an accurate picture of the situation. Jonathan nodded. Set it up. I want to leave for the store in an hour. As the meeting concluded, Jonathan stood up, still deep in thought. He knew the road ahead would be difficult. He would have to face the very people who had been working under him, the ones who had kept the wheels of the business turning. But it wasn't just about fixing the store. It was about fixing himself, too. 2 hours later, Jonathan stood outside the flagship store. He had arrived unannounced, without warning, just as he had planned. The storefront gleamed under the bright lights, but something about it felt different today. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of tension that hadn't been there before. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The familiar jingle of the doorbell echoed through the store, but the usual bustle of customers was missing. The employees behind the counter didn't greet him with their usual enthusiasm. Instead, they looked up briefly, then returned to their work, their expressions blank. Jonathan made his way to the back of the store, where he found Sarah, still behind the counter, looking just as composed as she had when he last saw her. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. "Can we talk?" She looked up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly, but she didn't refuse. "What's on your mind, Mr. Pierce?" Jonathan wasn't sure how to approach this conversation. He had come here to confront the issues, to get the truth, but now that he was standing face to face with Sarah again, it felt harder than he expected. "I need to know what's really going on here," he said. "I need to understand why things are falling apart." Sarah met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something like empathy in her eyes. "You don't know, do you?" she asked softly. Jonathan shook his head, confusion evident in his expression. "No, I don't." She sighed and leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's about trust, Mr. Pierce. And it's about time you figured that out." Jonathan stood there in the dimly lit corner of the store, his heart racing. Sarah's words hit him harder than he could have anticipated. "It's about trust, Mr. Pierce. And it's about time you figured that out." The weight of her gaze lingered, sharp and piercing, like she could see right through him. He had spent years building his empire, a business he was proud of, but now, standing here in the very place where it all started, everything seemed out of place. The people he trusted, the employees he'd worked tirelessly to support, were all telling him that something was wrong. And he hadn't even noticed. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken words. Jonathan felt an unease creep up his spine. He'd always prided himself on his ability to lead, to make decisions with certainty. But now, with everything unraveling before him, that same confidence seemed like a distant memory. It was as if he was losing control of something much bigger than he could have imagined. "I don't understand," Jonathan said finally, his voice tight. "What trust? What are you talking about?" Sarah sighed, her shoulders slumping as if she, too, were carrying an unseen burden. She looked around the store, her gaze distant, before she spoke again. "Trust isn't just about what's said, Mr. Pierce. It's about what's unsaid. What's implied. It's about how people feel when they walk through these doors. Do they feel like they matter? Or do they feel like they're just another cog in a machine, another number on a report?" Jonathan's throat tightened. Was that how they felt? He had spent so much time making sure the business ran smoothly that he had failed to realize how disconnected the employees had become. It wasn't just a few disgruntled workers, it was a culture of disenchantment, and it was spreading like wildfire. "You've created a company that operates like a machine," Sarah continued, her voice low. "And machines don't care about people. They don't care about what happens to the individuals who run them." Jonathan clenched his fists, his frustration mounting. He had built this company from nothing, had given his all to its growth, but now, he was beginning to realize that he had made a critical mistake. He had treated his employees like resources, not people. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Jonathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's eyes softened, a mix of sympathy and resignation in her gaze. "We tried. But no one listens. It's easier to ignore the problems when you're focused on the numbers. It's easier to pretend everything is fine when you don't have to face the consequences of your actions." Jonathan stood there, silent, his mind racing. How had it come to this? The store, the employees, the culture, it was all falling apart, and he had been too blind to see it. "I didn't know," he finally said, his voice strained. "I didn't know it had gotten this bad." Sarah nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "No one does. Until it's too late." Jonathan stared at her, unsure of what to say next. The reality of the situation was sinking in, and it was worse than he had ever imagined. He had built this company to be a symbol of success, of hard work and ambition. But now, it seemed that success had come at a cost. His employees had paid the price. "You're right," Jonathan said finally, his voice tinged with regret. "I've been too focused on the wrong things. I've been so caught up in the business that I've forgotten about the people who make it all possible." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She just looked at him, as if weighing his words, as if deciding whether or not she believed him. Then, after a long pause, she spoke again. "It's not too late to fix things," she said softly. "But it's going to take more than just words. You can't just come in here, give a speech, and expect everything to change overnight. The damage has been done. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild." Jonathan took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He knew she was right. Fixing the problems at the store wasn't going to be easy. It was going to require real change, not just superficial gestures. And more than anything, it was going to require a shift in mindset, a shift from seeing employees as tools for success to seeing them as partners in that success. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes," Jonathan said, his voice steady now, but with a newfound determination. "I can't undo what's happened, but I can change how things move forward. I can fix this. I just need you to help me." Sarah regarded him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll help you, Mr. Pierce. But you have to be ready for the truth. You have to be ready to face the hard reality." Jonathan swallowed. "I'm ready." She looked around the store one last time, her gaze lingering on the employees who were still working silently, oblivious to the conversation taking place in the back. "It's going to take more than just you. You need to show them you're serious. You need to prove that you care." Jonathan nodded. He knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, and there would be no quick fix. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope. He could make things right. He could rebuild the trust that had been broken. "I'll start with the employees," Jonathan said, his voice resolute. "I'll talk to them. I'll listen to their concerns." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Don't just listen. Act. Actions speak louder than words." Jonathan nodded again, more determined than ever. "I understand. I'll make it right." With that, he turned to leave, but Sarah stopped him with a final question. "Mr. Pierce," she said, her tone serious, "are you ready to face the consequences of your actions?" Jonathan paused, the weight of her question hanging in the air. He didn't know what consequences awaited him, but he knew one thing for certain: he had to face them, no matter how difficult. There was no turning back now. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. As Jonathan walked out of the store and into the night, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had a long road ahead of him, but he was no longer afraid to face it. He would rebuild the trust that had been lost. He would make things right, not just for the company, but for the people who had made it possible. The next few days were a blur of meetings, long hours, and hard conversations. Jonathan met with employees, one by one, listening to their concerns, hearing their stories. It wasn't easy. Many were skeptical, angry even. They had been ignored for so long, their voices silenced by the corporate machinery that had once seemed so invincible. But slowly, Jonathan began to understand. He began to see the cracks in the foundation, the deep-rooted dissatisfaction that had festered for so long. It wasn't just about wages or hours or workloads, it was about respect. It was about feeling valued. It was about knowing that the company, the very place they had given their time and energy to, cared about them as individuals, not just as employees. Jonathan made changes. Small changes at first, but meaningful ones. He instituted new policies for communication, creating channels where employees could voice their concerns without fear of retribution. He restructured the leadership team to include more employee representatives, ensuring that decisions were made with everyone in mind. But most importantly, Jonathan made a commitment. He committed to being present, to being there for his employees in a way that he had never been before. He wasn't just the CEO anymore. He was a part of the team, and he was ready to prove it. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere at the store began to change. The employees were still cautious, but there was a shift. The tension began to ease. The complaints, while still present, became more constructive, more solutions-oriented. Jonathan's efforts were slowly starting to pay off. But even as things improved, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he was still missing. The truth about Sarah's words haunted him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than he had yet uncovered. And as he sat in his office late one night, reviewing the latest reports, something in his gut told him that this was just the beginning. Jonathan sat in his office late into the night, staring at the papers scattered across his desk. He had made progress, but the weight of the situation still hung heavily over him. The changes he had implemented were working, slowly, but there was still a sense of unease, as if he were walking on a tightrope, balancing between success and failure. But what really troubled him was the lingering feeling that something much deeper, was lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The door creaked open, and Sarah entered, her face set in an expression of quiet determination. Jonathan hadn't expected her to come by tonight, especially not after everything that had transpired. But something about her presence felt like a signal, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this. She had been his guide, the one who had shown him the cracks in his empire, the ones he had ignored for too long. "Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice calm but firm. "There's something we need to discuss." Jonathan looked up at her, his brow furrowing. "What is it?" She hesitated for a moment, then walked over to the desk and sat down across from him. Her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, he saw something in them that he hadn't noticed before: concern. True concern, not just for the company, but for him. "Are you sure you're ready to uncover the truth?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. Jonathan swallowed hard. The truth. He had spent the last few weeks focusing on the small changes, the day-to-day operations, but now he realized that Sarah was right. There was something bigger at play, something far more complex than just employee dissatisfaction or trust issues. "I don't think I have a choice anymore," Jonathan replied, his voice steady but laced with a sense of urgency. "I need to know what's really going on." Sarah nodded slowly, as if she had been expecting this moment. She leaned forward, her gaze never leaving his. "You've made some significant strides," she said, "but what you don't know is that there's more to this story than you realize. It's not just about what's happening here in this store. It's about something much bigger. Something you've been blind to for a long time." Jonathan's pulse quickened. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "What are you talking about?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest as if preparing to explain something that would change everything. "Do you remember the day you first opened this store?" she asked, her voice steady, as if testing his memory. Jonathan's mind flashed back to the early days, those long hours spent getting the place up and running. The excitement, the energy, the sense of possibility. It felt like a lifetime ago, but he still remembered it vividly. "Of course I do," he replied, his voice softening as he thought about the journey that had brought him here. "I was full of hope. I thought we were creating something special." Sarah nodded, but there was no warmth in her eyes, only a kind of quiet sadness. "What you didn't know, Jonathan, was that from the very beginning, you were being played. The people you trusted, the ones you thought were on your side, had their own agendas. And those agendas weren't aligned with yours." Jonathan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "What are you saying? Who's been using me?" Sarah looked down at her hands, her fingers tapping against the edge of the chair as she collected her thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, more measured. "The ones who've been controlling things behind the scenes," she said. "The ones who've been manipulating the direction of the company, the ones who've been pulling the strings. You've been so focused on your role that you never questioned them. They've been using you as a pawn, Jonathan. And they've been doing it for a long time." Jonathan's mind raced. He had always trusted his inner circle, his most trusted advisors, the ones who had been with him from the beginning. How could they have betrayed him? He had built this company from the ground up, sacrificed everything for it. And now, to hear that those closest to him had been working against him, it felt like a betrayal he couldn't comprehend. Who are they? Jonathan asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Who's behind this? Sarah's eyes flickered, a flash of hesitation crossing her face before she spoke again. It's not just one person, she said. It's a network of people, all of them with different motives, all of them working to keep things in their favor. Some of them have been with you since the beginning, others have come in more recently. But they've all played a part in creating the situation you're in now. Jonathan's mind was reeling. He could feel the ground beneath him shifting, everything he had built starting to crack apart. He had thought he had built something solid, something that could stand the test of time. But now, it felt like everything was built on a lie. How long have you known about this? Jonathan demanded, his voice tinged with a mixture of anger and confusion. Sarah met his gaze, her eyes calm but filled with a deep understanding. Longer than you think. I've been watching, Jonathan. Watching the way things have unfolded. Watching the way certain people have manipulated you, have manipulated the situation. But I couldn't tell you before. You weren't ready to hear it. Jonathan clenched his fists, his anger rising. So you've known this whole time, and you didn't say anything? I couldn't, Sarah replied quietly. I didn't want to be the one to break the illusion. I didn't want to be the one to shatter your world. But I can't stand by any longer and watch you destroy everything. Jonathan stood up abruptly, pacing the room, his mind spinning. How could this have happened? How had he been so blind? The people he had trusted, the ones he thought were loyal, they had all been playing him. It felt like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. I need to know everything, Jonathan said finally, his voice firm with newfound resolve. I need to know who's been behind this. I need to know the truth, Sarah. All of it. Sarah nodded, her face serious. I can give you the names. I can give you the information. But understand this, once you know, there's no going back. The truth is going to change everything. Jonathan didn't hesitate. I'm ready. I've already lost everything I thought I knew. I can't keep living in the dark. Sarah leaned forward, her voice quiet but filled with urgency. Then listen closely, because once you start down this path, there's no turning back. The people who've been controlling things, they're not just employees or advisors. They have connections that go far beyond this store, far beyond your company. They've been using you as a stepping stone for their own ambitions. And if you don't act fast, you could lose everything, not just your business, but your freedom. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. What had he gotten himself into? How deep did this web of lies stretch? He had no idea, but one thing was certain, he was going to find out. Jonathan could feel the weight of Sarah's words hanging in the air like an oppressive fog. Everything he had worked for, the store, the success, the dreams, was built on a house of cards, and someone, or rather, a group of people, was slowly pulling it down. He had always considered himself a man of reason, someone who worked hard to build his empire with careful calculation and strategy. Now, in the face of this overwhelming truth, those very qualities felt like a curse. I need to act quickly, Jonathan muttered to himself as he sat back down behind his desk. His fingers drummed nervously on the surface of the table. Every moment that passed was another moment those behind the scenes had to tighten their grip, to manipulate things further. But Jonathan didn't know where to start. How do you fight an enemy you can't even see? How do you expose the people who've worked so quietly, so methodically, to destroy everything you've built? Sarah had left him with the names, but Jonathan knew that these weren't just simple people to confront. These were individuals who had maneuvered through the company like shadows, carefully cultivating alliances and distancing themselves from anything that might raise suspicion. Exposing them would be a delicate operation, one that could spiral out of control in an instant. And yet, he couldn't do nothing. His gut told him that if he remained passive, everything would unravel in ways he couldn't possibly predict. He glanced at the files Sarah had handed him. The names were all familiar, people he had worked closely with. He had trusted them, some of them were even his closest friends. Each of them had played a role in his rise, a role that now appeared to be nothing but a carefully staged performance. He couldn't decide whether he felt betrayed, angry, or just lost. Jonathan took a deep breath and looked out the window. The city lights twinkled beneath him, but they felt distant, cold. He had built his empire on the idea that he was different, that he could overcome anything. But now, everything seemed so fragile. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He didn't have to look up to know who it was. "Come in," he said. Sarah stepped inside, her face calm, but her eyes betrayed a hint of uncertainty. Jonathan could feel the tension between them. She had given him the information he needed, but she also knew the dangers of what lay ahead. She wasn't just helping him for the sake of the company, she had her own reasons for being involved, reasons she had never fully shared. But Jonathan couldn't focus on that now. He needed answers. And he needed them fast. "Have you thought about what we discussed?" Sarah asked, closing the door behind her. "I've been thinking about it non-stop," Jonathan replied, running a hand through his hair. "But I don't know where to start. I don't know how to take down something that's been so carefully hidden for so long. These people, they've been here from the start. They know every weakness. They know every move I'll make before I even make it." Sarah took a step forward and placed a reassuring hand on the desk. "That's why we have to outsmart them. We have to think like them." Jonathan met her gaze. "But how do we do that without destroying everything else?" Sarah's expression grew more intense. "We can't afford to think about it that way anymore. We've already lost so much. The question now is, what are you willing to sacrifice to take them down?" Jonathan stared at her, his thoughts racing. He had always been a man of principle, someone who avoided cutting corners. But he was realizing, in this moment, that playing by the rules would get him nowhere. The people behind this conspiracy weren't playing by the rules, they were bending them, breaking them, and using them to their advantage. "I don't know," Jonathan said finally, the weight of his words heavy in the silence. "I just know I can't keep pretending that everything is fine. I've worked too hard to let it all slip away." Sarah nodded, her eyes flickering with understanding. "Then we need to do something bold. We need to show them that you're not afraid to play the game, that you're not just some pawn they can move around. We need to make them think twice." Jonathan let the words sink in. It wasn't just about exposing them anymore, it was about taking back control. But how? He was a businessman, not a detective. He had built a company on principles of trust and hard work, not on manipulation or deceit. "Okay," Jonathan said after a long pause, the decision settling in his mind. "I'll do it. But I need your help. I need you to help me gather the evidence. We can't just accuse them without proof." Sarah's eyes gleamed. "I've already started. I've been collecting things, quietly, without raising suspicion. But you're right, we need to be careful. One wrong move, and we could both be in danger." Jonathan's mind spun. There was no turning back now. He was in too deep. It wasn't just about the company anymore, it was about his very freedom. The people who had used him as a pawn were not the type to let him walk away unscathed. If he wanted to take them down, he had to be strategic. And he had to act quickly. As the hours passed, Jonathan and Sarah worked together in the quiet of the office, making plans and laying the groundwork for their next move. They worked tirelessly, building a case against those who had manipulated him, gathering the pieces of the puzzle that would expose the conspiracy. Each new revelation felt like a blow to Jonathan's confidence, but he pushed through. He had no choice. The following morning, Jonathan's phone buzzed on his desk. He glanced at the screen, his heart sinking as he read the message from his lawyer. "We need to meet. There's something urgent." He felt a chill run down his spine. What had they discovered? Were his enemies already closing in on him? "I have to go," he told Sarah, his voice tight with apprehension. "But I'll be back. We're getting closer. We just need to stay one step ahead." Sarah nodded, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "Be careful, Jonathan. This isn't just about your company anymore. It's about your future." Jonathan left the office with a sense of urgency in his step, the weight of the truth pressing down on him like a heavy burden. As he walked toward his lawyer's office, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. But by who? And why? When he arrived at the lawyer's office, the door was already ajar. He stepped inside, and his lawyer, Thomas, greeted him with a grim look on his face. "What is it?" Jonathan asked, his voice sharp. "We've found something," Thomas said, his tone low. "Something big." Jonathan felt his pulse race. "What is it?" Thomas handed him a thick file. "Take a look." Jonathan opened the file, and as he scanned the pages, his breath caught in his throat. It was the missing piece of the puzzle. Evidence that pointed to the people he had trusted, the ones closest to him, were involved in a network that stretched far beyond the company. The conspiracy was bigger than he could have ever imagined. And now, they had crossed a line. "We need to act fast," Jonathan said, slamming the file down on the desk. "I can't wait any longer." Thomas nodded grimly. "I'll handle the legal side. You focus on the rest. But Jonathan, be careful. These people are powerful, and they won't hesitate to silence you if they think you're a threat." Jonathan's eyes hardened with resolve. "I've already lost everything. What's left to fear?"